All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for somewhat of a short notice, but we thought very timely webinar refresher on the topic of late blight. So here in PEI, here the last couple of weeks and so far this season, we're probably thinking, oh, this is definitely blight weather. It's been muggy, it's been wet, and lots of people are kind of got those questions about late blight again, and we haven't really dealt with late blight much here in the last few years. We are testing for spores every week and trying to provide growers with as much information as we can in terms of whether there's whether the inoculum's around and how to manage accordingly. But we thought it would be worth having Dr. Rick Peters join us this morning to talk a little bit about just kind of give us a bit of a refresher on late blight for those of us that may not have had to deal with it much in the last few years. What is late blight? How does it spread? What is its life cycle? And what treatment or management options do we have for it? So many of you would probably know Rick quite well. He's a plant pathologist and researcher with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada here in Charlottetown. And he's well known to our industry. Has been doing a lot of research and work and extension with growers over the last more than 20 years. So with that, Rick, I'll turn it over to you. And if you want to share your screen and we'll get started.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. Ryan, I'm glad you didn't put a number or exact number on the number of years I've been around. So you reach a point where you don't want to see an exact number. And I'm getting toward that. But yeah, I'm glad to be here with everyone this morning. Like Ryan was saying, and he was kind enough to set up this webinar. But it was really sparked, I think, by Dwayne McNeil, who was indicating at our last industry meeting that, we haven't really seen blight for a while, and it's kind of off the radar for the last number of years, mainly because of the hotter, drier summers that we have been having over the last 5-6 years. But as Ryan mentioned, it's quite different this year. It is more, if you want to say, quote, late blight weather. So I just was going to run through a few slides, a few comments around blight. And yeah, like Ryan mentioned, if you have a question or a comment, put it in the chat, or I don't mind if you interrupt at any time when there's a spot during the presentation. That's great. I'd like this to be more of a discussion, really, and I'll probably reach out with some questions and maybe put a few people on the spot during the chat. So feel free to comment at any time. And I can't really do too many things at the same time anymore. So Ryan, I'm glad you're monitoring the chat and can help with that.
No problem.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen here now, hopefully. And you can let me know if it's going to work out okay. Yep. And I'll make it bigger here now. Is that all right?
That's great.
Okay, super. So just an update for 2023 on what we've been fighting around late blight. So we did complete a project last year, which was with the Horticultural Council of Canada, a project as part of the CAP initiative. And so we do have some idea recently of the situation across the country. So I'll mention that briefly. But more or less, I'm just going to talk about some of the general characteristics we look at when we think about blight. We'll start off with some basic symptoms. So it's caused by an organism called Phytophthora infestans. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. We think of it like a fungus because it looks and acts a lot like a fungus, but it's actually in this group called the eumycetes, which are more closely related to algae. And the reason is their cell walls are made of cellulose, just like plants are. most fungi have cell walls made of chitin, which is kind of like what you'd find in crab or lobster shells. So that's why they're in this special group. But anyway, we think of it like a fungus, and we tend to use fungicides to control it. So that's kind of symptoms. Typically, you'll see on the foliage kind of a water-soaked dark lesion develop, and that can quickly destroy the tissue. If you flip that over under moist conditions, you'll see this fuzz, this white fuzz, and that's the spores being produced, usually on the underside of the leaf. And there's a little quote here that I think you'll find interesting from some research done in the US, where if you have 1% of the foliar area of your field affected, that's 2 billion spores per acre. So it's incredibly epidemic when this thing gets going, and only one plant that has an infection producing spores can quickly lead to a serious problem. So that's why we really have to be proactive to deal with this rather than reactive, because once you do get disease, it's tough to manage after that. Much easier to stay on top prior to disease development. So we also get lesions on the stems, like you see here. So
I would say it rained like a bugger out here.
oh, sorry, was that a question there?
No, somebody didn't have their phone on mute.
Okay, cool. So you can see some lesions on the stems as well, not just the leaves. So that's important to note. And then, of course, the really key phase is the tuber disease. So later on, as the tubers are developing, the spores can wash off of these surfaces in rain events usually, and then filter down through the soil to infect the tubers. And you get this kind of rusty granular infection that you see here. It's a dry rot, but obviously in storage, you can often get bacteria coming in there and other organisms, which can turn this into more of a wet rot, but it starts out as a dry rot at first. Okay, now the other thing to consider is that potatoes aren't the only ones affected by this beast. It's any crop that's in that kind of solanaceous family, and we'll talk more about some of those crops in a few minutes. But tomato's a big one. So here's some examples of symptoms on tomato, and similar lesions on the leaves. And here's the tomato fruits. You can see that kind of rusty, granular look to those infections as well. And here's some stem infections. So looks pretty similar on the tomato as it would on the potato tissues. But I'll talk more about this later. This is an angle that's been really important for us in the potato industry because of the threat of tomatoes in producing inoculum that then transfers over to potato crops, causing issues. So, but we'll chat a bit more about that. I did want to mention here briefly too, that when you're thinking about looking at lesions on your foliage like this, gray mold can look a lot like this too. It's usually on the lower leaves, the older leaves, and it doesn't usually have this white fuzz underneath. But if you're seeing any kind of leaf lesions, I would recommend submitting a sample to Marlene down at the Plant Diagnostic Clinic. And under the microscope, it's pretty easy to tell between late blight and gray mold, early blight, any of these pathogens fairly quickly. So definitely get your tissue tested if you have any questions about what might be causing your problem. Okay, so this is a little diagram from my colleague Phil Wharton in Idaho. He did a nice job drawing this up, and I just want to quickly talk about a few important parts of the cycle of this organism. The main thing to know is that it only survives in living tissue. So it overwinters in potato tubers, and those tubers could then be used for seed, for example. They might end up in a cull pile, could be producing a volunteer plant. This thing doesn't survive in the soil so far in most production areas in North America. So we have a chance to, monitor that situation and perhaps nip it in the bud if we can reduce inoculum coming from the tubers, since that's how it overwinters. Now that's a bit different in some other places. In Europe now, there's places that have these round spores, they're called oospores, And those can actually survive in the soil and produce disease earlier in the season. So you can actually get infested soil with that particular spore. And fortunately, so far, we don't see that happening in most production areas in North America yet. But we're keeping an eye on that because you need both A1 and A2 types to have this happen. And usually we're only dealing with one or the other. But if we ever get both in the same production area, we could start to see this. So it's something we're keeping an eye on. But mostly we deal with these lemon-shaped spores, and those are the ones that fly around and land on your leaves and cause the infection, which then washes down to the tubers to infect the tubers. So this slide just shows you the disease triangle. It's kind of a basic plant pathology principle. And it basically says to get disease, you have to have a susceptible host, the right environment, and the pathogen present in a sort of a virulent form of the pathogen. So for sure, we have lots of susceptible hosts here. Most of our potatoes are pretty susceptible to late blight. There's some differences, but for the most part, they are susceptible. And I mentioned that there's other hosts now that are susceptible too, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. The environment hasn't been that conducive for late blight in the last few years. In fact, it's been more like an early blight environment. Well, early blight likes a hotter, drier type summer, maybe with some alternate wetting, but mostly hotter and drier. And we've had that recently, but this year, much wetter, as Ryan said. Temperatures at night are usually around 18, which is perfect for this pathogen. It likes things around 15 to 18 and moist free water. In the morning when you get up, there's moisture on the leaves and on the grass, like ideal conditions. So we definitely have that. But this is kind of the question mark. Do we have the pathogen present? And that's always a bit harder to know. And the next slide, I'll show you why, because it can come from a number of different places. We're starting to get a handle on some indications of this, and Ryan mentioned the spore trapping system that he has out there. And I might just put you on the spot for a second, Ryan, if you don't mind, just to briefly update everyone on what that system is and what's taking place with your network.
So we have two different sources of information on this, Rick. So we have one program that we're doing across the province with Spornado, which is based out of Ontario, but the testing is happening here in PEI. And we're doing 12 sites across the province. They're pretty well evenly spaced across the province in all the main production areas. And we're doing weekly testing. Samples are collected on Tuesdays, and we usually have results by Thursday, and we're sharing that back out with the producers. In addition, AirSpore, the AirSpore program based out of Quebec, they are doing a private service with a number of producers across the province, and they are sharing those results with the board as well. And I'm sharing those results kind of in aggregate. So I'll do sort of regional averages for spore counts because they cover more than just late blight. They're covering 3 or 4 pathogens, fungal pathogens. But so far, we haven't detected any late blight spores from any of the sites so far in PEI this year. There was one detection over in New Brunswick, I think 2 weeks ago, and there was a detection in Quebec, I think on Monday of this week. But so far, nothing in PEI.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. And as far as you know, those detections in New Brunswick and Quebec haven't been linked to any hotspot or any particular disease focus that you've heard of?
Not that I've heard of yet, no.
Okay, thanks. And Ryan did mention that they're trapping some other spores as well. And that's kind of why I brought up the gray mold, because I believe, Ryan, you mentioned that there have been some gray mold spores in the traps.
Yep. So we actually saw quite a bit of gray mold last week. But the numbers have decreased quite a bit this week. So last week in our Spornado system, more than half of probably about 2/3 of the traps, we had gray mold spores, which is kind of early for gray mold in my experience. But this week we were only at 2 out of 12. So it's gone down quite a bit. And in the air spore, the numbers in there have gone down probably by more than half as well this week. So yeah, the gray mold as we get a little bit away from actual rainfall and a little more sunshine, I imagine those numbers will go down a little bit.
Yeah, and just a quick aside on gray mold too is that it can affect a lot of different crops. So strawberries, even tulips, you might get spores coming in from lots of different types of hosts to infect potato plants. So, but one point I wanted to make about this, since this is usually, the pathogen is usually a bit of an unknown factor, even with the spore trapping, if you're not starting your management program until there's spores in those traps, it's late because there's already some disease happening at that point that those spores are being trapped, and those spores can be distributed quite widely. And to start, remember I said at the beginning, you need to be proactive with this disease. To start at that point would be a late start, and it's much better to have a management plan in place once those spores are found, so that you can then react, but you've already got a solid backbone there to help you out. And you'll see later that we usually decide our fungicide programs not just on the pathogen, but also on the environment. So if you have one or other or both, you have to make sure you're doing a rigorous program. And right now we definitely have the environment. And so that's why we're chatting today. So just a quick update on the strain situation in Canada. So the last 5 years, we haven't had a lot of blight to really get a handle on some of the more recent strains, but we have had a bit in Ontario and tomatoes. We've had some in BC, and we've been able in the last decade, really, when we think about over time, it's been mostly this US 23 that's been our main pathogen. And that changed in about, let me think, 2009, 2010. We used to have the US 8 before that, and then it completely switched over to this 23. And the reason that's important is this beast came in on tomato transplants. Back in 2009, 2010, Brian Beaton and I were looking around at some of the box stores, and we're finding tomato transplants infected with late blight and carrying this US 23 strain. And that's why this has sort of come in from southern US and displaced a lot of the older strains and has become the dominant one as far as we know now. Just a little bit about this strain. Like I said, it's been the predominant genotype in recent years. It's really aggressive on tomato foliage and fruit. It just melts tomatoes down. It's amazing how quickly it will do that. It tends to be less aggressive on the potato foliage, but still causes significant disease, but it's super aggressive on the tubers. So I find sometimes that I call this a bit of a sneaky strain, because you'll see it in your crop and you seem to be managing it pretty well with your program of fungicides or and so on. But there's enough there that spores will wash down the tubers and really cause a lot of tuber rot. So it's definitely something that's more, in a way, more difficult to manage, because it looks like you're doing a good job and then suddenly you get this tuber blight. And also you can get spore showers from adjacent fields causing tuber blight. I've seen that. So you could be doing a good job, but if your neighbor isn't, then you could still be in trouble. So it's definitely a strain that's causing us grief in certain situations on both tomatoes and potatoes. And although it tends to be sensitive to Ridamil early in the season, especially, we're finding that, the strains that we collect later in the season tend to be developing a little more resistance. So usually we're only talking about one Ridamil application to help out early on if you're going to use that product. It tends to be less effective for a second application. The organism can evolve pretty quickly, and that's what we're finding with some of these products. So I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about where the inoculum comes from, because we don't really have a good handle often on the pathogen in a given year. And I mentioned one source is these alternate hosts. And right now, tomato is probably the biggest and most important. We have seen infection on petunia, pepper, eggplant, and nightshade weeds. And we do a bunch of testing in greenhouses with, misters and moist environments in the wintertime. I haven't seen a lot of infection on either pepper or petunia or eggplant, so I don't think those are major players here. I don't even know if anyone's growing eggplant, heaven forbid, but I just don't like the taste of them, I guess. But these crops tend to be very, very minor players. They have other Phytophthora species that are more important in them, not infestans. But I have seen it on nightshade weeds. So controlling nightshade weeds can be important control measure for late blight as well. And then the tomato angle is probably the most critical, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Infected potato seed is another important source of inoculum. So an infected seed that's planted could produce an infected plant. Those sprouts, it'll move along the developing sprouts. And once the plant emerges, you'll get a disease lesion and spores produced. So that's certainly a possibility. And I should mention too that the spores can spread during the cutting and handling process. So if you have an infected seed piece and you're cutting it and some sporulation on the surface, it can spread to the other cut pieces and cause a spread of the disease that way. So there are seed treatments now available to help with that, if that's a concern. Best option there, though, of course, is to know your seed lot, know where your seed's coming from, if there was blight in the field, in that seed field, etc., and grading out any diseased tubers that you see prior to planting. So those are all important measures. Some years we have a lot of volunteers. How's that situation this year, Ryan? Do you have a pulse of that?
It's spotty, Rick. There will be some places where there are definitely a few volunteers around, particularly maybe close to hedgerows, that sort of thing. But I also have a lot of growers telling me that, maybe the volunteers aren't as bad as they thought. So I think it's spotty.
Okay. So they're concerned because obviously if there was an infected tuber, you could get an infected plant that way, but also they tend not to get the fungicide coverage. So if there are spores around, they'll get infected right away and be a source of inoculum. So they're a concern. Cull piles, the reason we dispose of them is because you can get infected tubers that are in culls producing spores that can infect the crop. It doesn't have to be producing plants like you see in this picture. You can get sporulation right from the tuber surface. So either case here would be a problem. And then the last comment here is around adjacent fields or production areas. This is very much, as we call, a community disease, because if there's a disease in one area, it can quickly, of course, spread to surrounding areas. And in the past, we've even tracked spores coming up the eastern seaboard in storm systems. We've seen strains move that way, especially on cloudy, wet days. The spores are actually pretty sensitive to sunlight and drying. They're kind of wimpy in that way, but if it's cloudy and wet, they're very good at moving in storm systems and can travel many kilometers that way. So that's also a concern. So I mentioned tomatoes is a really big factor now with this US23 strain. So we've been trying to get this message out to home gardeners. Probably should do it again this year, given the weather that we're having. But we're trying to get people to look for disease in the plants they buy and in their home gardens to destroy and bag any diseased plants. Don't put them in like compost piles where they can still produce spores, but bag them in your and put them in your trash. And the main recommendation here is to grow resistant varieties. So some really good varieties that come out of the North Carolina State Breeding Program, and there's other programs now, breeding programs that are producing late blight resistant tomato varieties. and they're very effective. We've tested these in the greenhouse with misters and inoculated a number of varieties, things like Mountain Merit and Jasper and Mountain, I think it's Mountain Magic. I always want to say Magic Mountain, but it's Mountain Magic. And they work very well against the US 23 strain that we have. And now, since we did a bit of outreach on this a number of years ago, most of the outlets now will have these resistant varieties available for purchase. But having said that, there's definitely still susceptible stuff because, people have their favorite varieties. A lot of times could be heritage or heirloom varieties, and they are very susceptible. So that's why we really need this observation and destroying of disease plants too. So yeah, maybe we need to do that a little bit more this year again, Ryan, just to get that message out again.
So
sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
Rick, Eileen Beaton let me know yesterday that the department has updated their brochure that they worked with you on a few years ago on that, specifically target at the home gardeners and things. And there are copies of that brochure available at some of the co-ops and agro centers and at some of the Access PEI sites. So and those are available if anybody wants any copies of them and that sort of thing. But we are also looking at doing some communication from this office as well.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. That's great. So with this issue, crop scouting is huge because you really want to, find any disease focus early. And then, as I mentioned, using the diagnostic service to find out what lesions you're dealing with. Marlene would be happy to help you there, and that's important. And you need a quick response. So if there's a hot spot found, usually we try to destroy not only the affected plants, but the surrounding plants and really increase the fungicide program. And I've got a little graphic here that I borrowed from my colleague Khalil in New Brunswick. And it's a graphic that was first developed by Walt Stevenson in Wisconsin. And it kind of shows nicely that if you have an affected plant here, it's important to destroy the surrounding plants twice the size of the affected area. And the reason is that these plants are probably infected too, just not showing symptoms. So you want to get rid of those before they start to show symptoms and release spores. And it's a little more difficult if you have a field where the infection has been scattered and there's a little focus of or a little sprinkling of disease everywhere. Then aggressive fungicide program would be important. And depending on how things develop, I mean, I have seen situations where entire fields have been killed down to stop the spread. So hopefully you don't get to that point, but it's a very epidemic disease, so it certainly can move quickly. The only thing I want to mention on this slide really that might be something to consider is the irrigation management. Usually that's more important later in the season or enlarging, and if there's spores around, and the irrigation can wash those down to the tubers. So that's a consideration. And then fertilization, we never want to over fertilize because obviously it's not helping in terms of productivity, but it also, whenever you have a very healthy, very lush tops, lots of tops, late blight loves that. It's not like some diseases like early blight where it likes a stressed plant, usually later in the season as the plant is aging. Late blight loves a healthy, vigorously growing plant, and it will take advantage of that situation. So let's talk a bit about fungicide, because that's definitely one of the key management options to control this disease. I mentioned starting early is critical with a preventative program. because once you have disease, it's much more difficult to manage the problem. Good coverage is important, and I'll show you in the next slide why that is. And the other factor here, of course, is that if you're in this aggressive, or excuse me, really explosive, I guess is a better word, growth stage where the plants are growing quickly, and it's very difficult to protect that new foliage as the plants grow so quickly. That's where you can sometimes have some advantage in using some of the specialty products. And we tend to talk about those when the weather conditions are conducive, when the plants are rapidly growing, and or disease risk is high because we're seeing some spores. And so it's not both conditions. Like I said before in the triangle picture, it's one or the other. So if we have conducive weather conditions like we have now, it makes sense to use some of these other products that are not just protectants to help out if there are spores that show up. And we'll talk in more detail about that here in a minute. So the fungicides that we tend to have available to manage late blight come in sort of different categories, I guess you could call it. And I'll just go through some of those here. So this is just a picture on the left of a fungicide being applied to a plant, those little red dots. Some of our products that are just contacts, and I'll put a C down here, and that'll make more sense in the next slide. But those products just sit on the leaf surface. And what they're meant to do is when a spore flies over and lands on that leaf, it will not be able to germinate and infect because this product is there. So you can see how in contacts, it would really be an advantage to go more often. You know, we usually think about a weekly schedule, but if the plant is growing rapidly, that's not giving you much coverage of those new tissues that are forming because it is growing so rapidly. And in this case, coverage is huge. And the other thing that shows is if those red dots are the fungicide and a spore lands somewhere between those dots, well, it can still infect. And so that's another reason that the coverage is critical. And I might get someone with more expertise on that aspect, like Dwayne, to maybe comment on water volumes and so on, other factors that help with coverage. Do you want to have anything to?
I think to your point, Rick, early application's key. When I arrive at some fields and I just see the rows closing and the guy's getting his second contact on, we're lucky. We don't have blight spores around. Hopefully we don't. I think the key to this session is understanding blight, that we have to take a proactive approach on the protectant side, because there's no curative. Like I got a text from a colleague or whatever talking about, late blight. They're finding late blight in Allison, Ontario. And, to that point, there's lots of systemic fungicides on these fields are finding late blight on. So if you get contact in those fields, the next spray you might put on is Reglone. So I think the key is to see what strains up in Ontario in case, you get these storm fronts. It just seems to be, rain every few days this time. It's a change. We're not used to it. But to know what that is, what strain that is, and is it sensitive to Ridimel or not, or, should we take looking at other products, because Bernadette, she looked at the products available, like, we don't have the Tattoo or Acrobat that we had, 10 or 15 years ago that we used to go back to back to back and dry it up. There's none of that. So unless Ridimel is going to stop it, it's sensitive to Ridimel, which by the sound of that, if they have Ridimel on, obviously it's continuing to progress or infect the crop. So it's just a concern. Anybody's been around when we've had late blight before, it's not a pleasant experience, and they're very difficult to manage and very stressful. And there's a lot of money in this crop. It's probably the most expensive crop people have ever planted. So I think the key is, we don't have blight spores, thankfully, we're lucky. Let's make sure we get contacts on there and systemic fungicides so that if spores do come in on a storm front, we have the protection so that we're not in a mess. I think that's the key. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Dwayne, for those comments. And just before we leave the contact fungicides, and next slide, I'll show that in a bit more detail. The coverage is super important, and water volumes are certainly a factor there. So that's something to consider. I'm going to skip this middle one here for a second and pop over to translaminar. Now on the next slide, which I'll show you, there's a couple of categories that would fit here called PND and EC. I'll explain those in a minute. But these translaminars, and you might call them locally systemic, there's lots of different phrasing for them, but essentially they don't just contact the leaf. Once it's sprayed on, they can actually move a little bit within the leaf cells. Not very far though. You notice it's not going into the plant stem or anywhere else. It's not moving upward. Pretty much just moving across the leaf surface. But that's pretty helpful, because if the, in this case, if a spore lands and the contact isn't stopping its germination, it can infect, and then these products are still within those adjacent cells to help stop that infection. So, that's another step up from the contacts. Then these systemic ones, now these ones would be called PAD in the next graphic I'm going to show you. And that means that they're systemic, but they tend to move only in the upward direction. So they will move toward the new developing leaves, but they don't move down into the tubers, for example. So things like Ridamil would go in this category, where they're applied and they tend to move upward to protect some of the newer tissues. And there's some other products that we'll talk about, but that's not completely systemic, but I guess ascending. The A here is for ascending because it moves in that upward direction. And then the last one here is a completely systemic product. And you'll see it's called CS in the next slide. Here it's amphimobile, but what that means, it can easily move both up and down, up to the new tissues and down to the tubers. And the only product that we have that fits this category are the phosphites. Your Fostrol, your Confine, and your Rampart. Those are the only products that are completely systemic like this. And that's why I talk about them a lot for tuber blight control and pink rot control in tubers as well. But this slide here, and don't worry about it, it's small. I'm not going to talk about it in a ton of detail, but it was shared to me by Ryan, and I think, Ryan, you could probably share this with the group, maybe even during the presentation or afterwards. But it's from the Country Guide, and it really lists all the available products in Canada for the most part. In this case, it's foliar fungicides. There's also charts for herbicides and insecticides and seed treatments, and you name it. But it's a fairly good overview of the products, their commercial name, their common active ingredient name, what fungicide group they're in. Oops, sorry about that. What fungicide group they're in. And here's the one I was just talking about, this mode of action. So if you look and you find a C, that's just a contact. So C here would be, for example, if you go up to Bravo zinc, there's a C, it's just a contact. Typically, we also have the manzates. So there's the manzates are just contacts. And the next level up are these ECs and PNDs. So ECs are elaborated contacts. They have some anti-spoiling action because they do move a little bit from where they're applied. And then these penetrating, non-diffusing, or translaminar. So those are the ones, these are the ones that just move kind of across the leaf. There's some movement away from where it's applied to give you a little bit added protection. So if you go through here and you can see some of the ECs and some of the PNDs. So there's, for example, let's see, for late blight, we've got Reason here, a PND. So there's a little bit of movement there. Revis. So you can go through and see which ones apply to that particular type of product. And then we have the ones that move just upward, the ascending diffusion, so PAD. So you can see Ridamil would be a PAD because there is some upward movement. And you also have things like Quadris and so on. So you can have a look at where those fit in the spectrum. And finally, the completely systemic, as I mentioned, are things like your Fostrol and Confine, that sort of thing. So the next grouping here, you can see what diseases each of these foliars control. And you'll notice that most of them are targeted at either early blight or late blight. Lots of the X's there. And if you go down the late blight column, you'll see which ones have been registered for that use. And, since this is Canada and we register products in this country, efficacy is part of that registration. So we've done a lot of work with several products to develop data sets that companies use to register their products. So if they're here and they're registered or on the label, there's evidence that they provide some control or suppression of that disease. So, that's a good situation that we have here in that sense. Some of these last columns here, talk about number of applications, interval between, that kind of thing. So there's different details you can see here. So this is kind of a valuable overview, I think. And like I said, Ryan might be able to share that, or should be able to, either after the presentation or during. Just a comment on a few of these different categories. So the contacts we talked about, what are their advantages? Well, they do prevent the spores from germinating, like I mentioned, and therefore they prevent the disease from starting. They're usually less expensive, which is a plus. However, they have to be applied regularly, and you have to tighten the schedule if there's increased disease risk, which means the plants are growing rapidly, so there's uncovered tissue, or the weather's conducive like it is now. It can be hard to keep up with that new growth because it does happen so rapidly in these conditions when there's so much moisture and warm temperatures. And obviously weather is a concern because you can't always get out to the field to do what you want to do when you want to do it. So there's some limitations obviously to these. The next step up, these ones that you might call penetrants or translaminars or locally systemic, the advantage is they can penetrate some of these leaf tissues and address some of the infections if they do get through past the contacts. And that way they also tend to reduce the sporulation. So they slow down that epidemic development, giving you a bit more time to manage the problem. Some considerations, they don't help plants that are already showing symptoms. That's too late. And they tend to be more expensive, which isn't surprising. These ones that are uply mobile, the systemic, so they only move in the xylem, which is the plumbing that goes from the roots up to the top of the plant. The phloem is the plumbing that goes from the leaves down to the roots and tubers. These ones only go up. So again, they do penetrate and can address new infections and also reduce sporulation and can move to those new leaf tissues, which can be an advantage when a rapidly growing stage like we have now. So Ridamil would apply here, but if it's US23, we do have some sensitivity to Ridamil, as I mentioned, especially early on. But later there's some reduction in sensitivity. So if what Dwayne is saying in Ontario and they're using Ridamil, they're probably starting to see that it's not working as well as time goes on because the organism is adapting to that product. Again, it's not helping plants showing symptoms. Again, I mentioned this resistance issue, which unfortunately is a reality with a lot of our newer products. The old products, the old contacts like chlorothalonil or Bravo and the Manzates, Mancozeb, they tend not to have resistance issues because they're broad spectrum, address a lot of different parts of the pathogen. But a lot of our new stuff tends to be very targeted at lower concentrations when they're applied, and the organism's much more easily adapted to those and can become resistant more readily. So that's an issue that will become even more important as time goes on and we move away from those older products as Health Canada phases them out of our production systems. So That's definitely something we have to keep an eye on, is the resistance issue. And then finally, the fully systemic ones, and I mentioned here the phosphites fit in. So lots of pluses. They don't just move upward, they also move downward to protect the tubers. There's little resistance risk because they work in a few different ways. They usually stimulate the plant's own defenses, but they also have some direct activity against the oomycetes. And we found in some of our trials too that you actually, because they're stimulating plant defenses, you get some protection against other diseases too, like even early blight and verticillium or early die. Not dramatic protection, but there is some reduction there just because the plant defense network is stimulated by these products. So they have kind of a unique activity. Again, though, they don't help plants that are already showing symptoms. And this one I'm going to highlight a bit. There is some phytotoxicity risk with these, especially if they're used later in the season and the plants are stressed. Either they're getting older or there's some real dry conditions, so there's water stress. That can be an issue, and I'll show you some pictures around that. And there's still a bit of caution of using these products on seed fields, because we have noticed that some of the plants that have received this product and we harvest the tubers from those, if we use them as seed, there's been a bit of a delayed emergence. But that's been inconsistent. It kind of needs more work to really see how significant that issue is. But right now it's kind of a caution. So here's an example of a confined treated plant on the top, 30 days after we inoculated with the late blight pathogen. In this case, this was done in collaboration with Gefu Wang Pruski in Nova Scotia at the Dalhousie Agricultural College. And on the bottom is the control. So you can see, it does actually give you some decent foliar control, but I wouldn't rely on it for that. Other products are better for the foliar aspect, but it's dynamite for the tuber rot aspect. It really moves down there and protects those tubers from infection in the field, which is pretty important. And I mentioned that we did notice a little bit of difference if we planted tubers from plants that received some of the phosphites or phosphorus acid at the label rates. And you can see Brian Beaton beside a row that's not coming up as quickly as the one on the right. And so that's been kind of intermittent. It's not something we see all the time, but because we did see it a little bit, we put that caution on there. So you'll notice on the confined label that there's a caution for using it on seed fields. That needs more research. But I mentioned sometimes you can get this burning effect, and so you can see that here, and it's usually at higher dosages as plants are getting older and getting water stressed, or there's also a strong variety effect. Some varieties are much more sensitive than others. Something like the Dakotas are quite sensitive to this product, where others are less so. Usually in a situation like we're in this year, where there's adequate moisture and good growth, it's not usually a problem. We tend to go with the very lowest rate that's recommended, something around 2 to 2.5 liters per acre for the first couple of sprays, and then reduce that as the season goes on later to avoid some of this phytotox. And we try to get around 7 liters per acre as a seasonal amount to get really good tuber rot control. But just something to be aware of. Andy Robinson in North Dakota is looking at this and has some nice data showing dosage and burning effects, and there's a strong link. But it really depends a lot on the weather too, and the way the crop is growing and the variety. So lots of factors there.
Hey, Rick.
So, yes.
Just a quick question while we're talking about phos acid.
Yep.
Question in the chat. Can you comment on tank mixing of phos acid with other products? Anything we should be watching for there? Any problems?
You know what? That's an area I don't have much information on, unfortunately. Dwayne also talked a little bit about tank mixing, and I tried to look some of that up. That's not something we've done because we've tended to work with these companies to try to get these products registered. We're often working in with them in isolation or alternating with other products rather than tank mixing. And, you know, if you look at the label, they always say something like do a jar test or do a little bit in your small section of your field and just see how that goes. Sometimes when you combine things, there might be more phytotox. Sometimes they don't work as well. So there's, it's almost like you need some of that local experience to really know the answer to that with so many different products and available and so forth. We have done mostly alternating with protectants, and that's worked well. But the tank mix part, I'd be interested if others have comments on that and personal experience in this group. Anyone want to shout out with a comment on tank mixes?
Bernadette or anybody from Agri there, you must have seen any issues. People, I know I've had a few calls, whatever. I haven't seen a lot of issues. I think the key with the phosphoric acid is you like to have it dry, you know, for a day, 24 hours after you apply it. But Melvin, anybody?
Dwayne, I think just, and again, nothing scientific, but it seemed to be if there was any foliars in the tank with the phos acid, then we saw more phytotoxicity in that case in the past. But again, that was when stressful conditions, right? But it seemed to exacerbate the damage.
Foliar fertilizers.
Yes, exactly.
So you've been applying some Bernadette in these great growing conditions. The tops look great. So there's not much under them yet, but have you been seeing much damage this year with the moisture?
No damage at all, Dwayne. And been going the full 2.3 liter rate.
And what kind of a program is that overall in? What kind of a alternation is that, Bernadette?
It's mainly right now at this point, Rick, because there's only been one application of the phos acid go on. So it's just been protectant, alternate it with a phos acid, then back to the protectant.
And is that usually like a mancozeb product or?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that probably is a question that maybe I can come back to the group with once I talk to some of my colleagues in the US that have worked with this product more in that sense. And perhaps if that's okay, Ryan, I'll get some more information on that to bring back to the group that you can disseminate if I find something.
Well, they're all coming here next week, so it's good timing.
Yeah, well, that's true. Everyone come out to the PAA meetings and we can ask them personally. But yeah, like I said, it's not something that we worked on a lot because we do tend to work either alternating or isolation because of collecting data for registration. So, but it's an important question. And, you know, if you look at the labels, there's not a lot of detail. It's kind of like you're on your own in a way, is what I gather from those comments on the label, because they probably don't want to risk unknown consequences. And fair enough. I mean, there's so many permutations and combinations that are possible, plus so many varieties and weather conditions that are possible that it you know, it is would be a bit of a difficult thing to nail down. I can see that. Okay, we'll move along here. So just an overview of our work on phosphites and kind of summary important points. Starting early before the disease is important, and we get good control of oomycetes as well as a few, you know, a little bit of control of some other things. You need a sufficient dose, and usually we target the 7 liters per acre, and that tends to get us about between 80 and 100 parts per million in the epidermis of the tuber, which is what we need to prevent tuber infection. And that's really what we're most interested in here. 3 to 4 spaced applications. And then of course, reducing the rates, as I mentioned, in times of stress or as the plants get older. Dwayne alluded to this, avoiding wash off. GetFoo's work showed that, the highest uptake into the tissues was 48 hours after application. So if you avoid some rain events if possible after application, that's helpful. And then I mentioned the seed issue is still a bit of a caution. This product can be used post-harvest as well. In some places, like in Manitoba, that was the main use, largely because they also saw a bit of silver scurf management when they did that, or have been doing that. The key here, though, is you got to put it on right after harvest as soon as possible. And the other key here is to know that it doesn't cure an infection that's already happened in a tuber. It can only kill the spores that are on the surface. So we tend to only really talk about this if it's there's a lot of moisture, that there's blight around, late in the season, you're going to harvest and you're worried that there's going to be blight spores coming up in the soil around the surface of those tubers. This product is dynamite at killing those spores. But if the tuber's already infected, it doesn't help you with that post-harvest. That's why I like the foliar the best, because it's getting down there and providing you season-long protection. And that protection goes into storage because those tubers have, like I said, 80 to 100 per million within their periderms. And that not only reduces infection in the field, but then going into storage. So it's a superior approach, given all the risks around it with phytotox and all of that. So just a quick comment on harvest. Obviously, killing things down. You don't want vines that are infected and still hanging around, keep spreading spores down to your tubers. So get those dead as quickly as possible. Grading out stuff that's diseased before you store it, and storing suspect tubers separately. There might be areas that you don't even harvest because it's too waterlogged or whatever. And I mentioned that there is a possibility of phosphite going to storage if you expect some spores around. So if I could summarize, think we've probably gone on for about an hour here, so it's time to wrap up and hope to field any questions or comments. So we're really kind of targeting this disease in tomatoes because of the strain we have now. Reduced sources of the initial inoculum. I mentioned all the potential ones, and each one can be managed, whether you're controlling nightshade weeds, whether you're making sure your seed isn't infected, whether you're using the spore trap system to look for spores when they're around. Scouting is huge. We don't really control the environment very much, but sometimes with irrigation and fertilization, we can a little bit. Making sure that you use any risk networks that we have in terms of weather and now the spore traps Ryan talked about. Community disease, so any information about late blight fines. And we just heard some from New Brunswick and Quebec and Ontario. That's all really important. And then, of course, the fungicide program tailored to your operation. Use that list as a guide. Protectants usually are the backbone, and then some of the locally systemic stuff when you have the conducive weather like we have now, or higher risk if spores are around. We talked about the phosphites, and it's good to alternate. Just a final comment, because I did mention a lot of these new products are prone to resistance. We've been looking for Arondis resistance and we haven't found it yet, but that's a product that I would suspect would be at high risk because it is so specific and low sort of concentrations that are used to manage the disease. So I'm definitely going to keep an eye on that one, because I think there is a risk there for sure. So alternating is important to prevent that resistance development. Thanks for your information. And then I did get an update from Bernadette and Dwayne. Just found it this morning before we came on. And that was essentially what fungicides are available and which ones are not. So I think, Bernadette, this came from you. So do you want to comment on this list at all?
I'll start off, Rick. I do have an error. The last one, Gavel BF, that is, it is still registered, and our procurement department is checking to see if it is available.
Okay,
It is something that can be added to the available list, and the now available was just ones that were not listed on that previous pamphlet that was done by 5 or 6 years ago by the department and such. So obviously there's more on that pamphlet that I hadn't included. These are just above and beyond what's already on that pamphlet.
right. So things like the phosphites are available, but they're just not included in your email here.
Yes, correct, Rick. Yeah,
Right.
because they were on that pamphlet. So yeah, unfortunately, our selection has been narrowed a fair bit over the last few years. So yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that, Bernadette. Is that sort of a COVID effect, or is there other factors that are reducing the number of tools available to us?
I'd say it's probably other factors more so, Rick. Just as far as some of the changing in suppliers from one active ingredient to another, just reformulations and such. So yeah. I think
Okay.
more of that.
So just looking at the ones you have here, I mean, Manzate, there's your contact. And then these other products, Arondis, Ultra, and Forum, have some of that systemic activity, upwardly systemic as well as sort of translaminar. And then Allegro would be more around the just the locally systemic sort of thing.
Yes.
So, and then of course the phosphites are available, which are completely systemic. So there are products that have that range of approach available. And you might want to consider, if you're just using contacts, going to some of these that have some more systemic activity, either locally or otherwise, given the weather that we're having. I guess that might be the take-home message, I guess you could say, maybe.
I did.
Sure.
I did share the list of, or I shared the country guide list that you had put up on the screen there, Rick. I shared that in the chat. So if anybody wants to take a look at that, you may have to talk to your supplier as to whether or not that is available for you. But of course, you know, there's some of the other products like, you know, Curzate and what else is listed for late blight?
Just going, just quickly there. This was looking at, Rick had did a report of how to manage late blight tidbits and stuff and gave the list of products. So 5 years ago, you had all these products that you could use or that were tentatively available. I guess to my points, I guess they're not available or may not be available with the gravel or the gavel there. So it's just your tools and your toolbox are getting pretty limited. So I like I said, I think the key is on the protective side, there's no curative for this late blight unless Ridamil and sensitive to Ridamil. But then I think we got to look at what strains in Ontario, and if that happened to get here, where are you at, right? So, and it goes back to the phos acids. And the reason the phos acids guys got away from them is you went through a few drought years and you're trying to get the 7 liters on, you're seeing the burn, and that, you know, growers want to be kind to their crops, so they don't like seeing burn. And you question whether the products actually get to the tuber when it's, you know, you're under drought conditions there. But back when we were using it in the late 2000s or whatever, with Robert Coffin there, you know, we weren't seeing the burn and the product worked or whatever. So, and we were starting to run into Ridamil resistance. And you want to just touch base on what you're seeing on pink rot there, Rick, while I think of it?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of pink rot, you know, we had a more extensive survey a number of years ago. We haven't done that recently. But when we did do that work, we did find Ridamil resistance mainly in the eastern part of the island, as opposed to the western part of the island. And that's something that we've noticed in other parts of the country too. So there's definitely and it averaged about 50%. So it was about 50-50 whether you had resistance or not. So based on that, we would kind of shy away from using it as a pink rot product for the most part, and perhaps using Aranda's Gold, in furrow type approach, or the phosphites, or a combination of the two, which is quite effective.
I think they're seeing similar resistance in New Brunswick, about 50-50 from what I understand from a few conversations over there as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
There's a couple other questions on the chat, Rick.
Okay.
So, question, is anyone testing dominant genotypes for resistance to actives such as CAA or fluazanam, in addition to metalaxyl?
Yes, so good question. We do have a student, Shagun Babarende, who's working at Dalhousie with actually Khalil's one of his supervisors. And he is testing a wide range of fungicides against the couple of the current strains, US 23 and 24 and US 8. So that data should be coming out relatively soon, because he's trying to graduate within a year. So I expect his information to be available within a year.
Great. Another question. Presidio, Ranman, and Allegro are all effective against zoospores. Is there a ranking scale in PEI for tuber blight options?
For tuber blight,
Yeah.
well, I haven't worked. See, some of those products, list those again, Ryan. Ranman,
Presidio, and Allegro.
yeah. So none of those are like the phosphites that are completely systemic. So their main activity is trying to reduce sporulation late in the season, so those spores don't filter down to the tuber. It's a little different, right? Because the phosphites are actually going to the tubers, protecting them while they're in the ground. Whereas these products are trying to get at the sporulation, so there aren't spores that go down the ground. So it's a different approach. Personally, in my experience, the phosphite approach has been superior to those types of product approaches, but not to say that if you're reducing your inoculum, obviously you're reducing your risk of tuber rot, but not completely. Whereas I find the phosphites tend to give you a really good protector shield down there. So it's kind of a different strategy.
You already touched on Arandas maybe being potential candidate for resistance, but so far we haven't been seeing it. There is a question. Oh, there's a question here. Can anybody comment on the availability of either Revis or Curzate?
I can't, so hopefully Bernadette or Dwayne maybe, or someone else on the call.
For us, the Curzate supply is very good, and Revis, I'd say, is quite decent. We haven't had any indication from Syngenta about it not being available going forward either.
Great. Does anybody use lateral flow devices for confirmation of late blight infection? That's beyond me, but
Lateral flow devices.
yeah.
Can that person elaborate? I don't think I've run across that.
Yeah, no, me either. There's one gentleman here that's got a lot of questions.
Most of our detection, like in the field, is still around Marlene's, microscopic detection when a sample comes in, or now you're spore trapping. And I believe with the spore trapping, they're looking at that microscopically as well, are they not, Ryan?
One of them is microscopic and one of them is qPCR.
One of them is qPCR. So we have got that network, but we don't have the qPCR and or those types of molecular tools available in the diagnostic clinic, to my knowledge.
So the qPCR spore trapping we do, that spore trap sits there all week. So that it collects everything that goes on the wind that week. And then the newer traps even have a little fan, and then they push a little more air through them. And then that, you get that sort of, it could have got deposited the minute after we put the trap in, or it could have been deposited the minute that before we took the trap out. It could be during that week, but it does give you an indication that it's there. Whereas The air sport program, which is done microscopically, that is just they go to the field and do a 15-minute collection of air deposited on the cartridge. And so you get more of a short snapshot of what is there anything on the air in the field at that time?
Right. Now, speaking of detection, there are systems out there that we're not using, but that other people do use in other places. And they can range from some of these ELISA type detection systems right down to taking like a little mini PCR system to the field and essentially extracting DNA and running a PCR right in the field. So those are available. And perhaps, even though I'm not familiar with the term, the lateral flow might be a system like that he's talking about. But
Eric just posted a link in the chat if you're interested in looking at it any further.
I would be.
Yeah, so you could take a look at that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patty, for chiming in that there's some other companies also have a good availability of some of those fungicides, including Revis. Oh, a question around nozzle types. What's the best recommendation for nozzle type to get the best canopy penetration?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when I asked earlier around the contact coverage and how important that is, and I mentioned water volumes, obviously nozzle is another factor there. Do we have someone on the call that's really good at water volumes, nozzles, something around coverage that could comment here? Robert used to talk about this a lot.
It's a little outside of my specific area of expertise, so I don't want to comment on something I'm not an expert, I'm not, that versed in.
Who's our spray specialist?
Wow. It's always been Ken Lingley, and Ken's not on here today, so.
But would answer that question?
Yeah, Ken would be able to answer that question, and there's probably some others as well that probably could.
So maybe that's another one to get back to on with Ken's comments.
Yeah. And I know Dwayne mentioned in our crop update meeting the other day, a lot of the focus too is like there's for people that still don't have rows fully closed in. It's, getting that penetration on before we're at full canopy, and getting some of these fungicides on. We shouldn't be going into row closure with only one fungicide on in a lot of cases, like just trying to make sure we have that good coverage on the lower leaves and that sort of thing. And that goes for not just for late blight, but that goes for early blight and brown spot and some of these other ones as well. We want to get that good coverage on the lower leaves. Jubbs, you got your hand up, go ahead.
Good day, Ryan and Rick. Just want to, on behalf of Cavendish, thank you fellas for putting the session on today. I think extremely valuable and informative, and just urge everyone to remain vigilant and diligent, but appreciate the efforts that everyone has put in today. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jubbs.
Thanks, Jubbs. So we're just about to end, and I just wanted to put up the there's a code or a QR code. Can everybody see that QR code that I'm sharing?
I see it.
You see it? Okay, great. So if you're a CCA and you want, there's one CEU for this meeting, you can scan that and get your CEUs. I'll leave it up here for a minute or two. If you don't have your phone on you or you don't have the app and you want to get CEUs, just email me your CCA number and I'll submit the form as well. But just wanting to make sure people have that opportunity if you're a CCA. Any other questions for Rick before we call it a day here?
Ryan?
Yep, go ahead, Newton.
Yeah, just a quick comment, just to share. I'm not expert on spraying, but I just want to share what we do on the couple questions that you mentioned about the type of nozzle. We do use the cone nozzles, the hollow cone nozzles. And regarding for the application of fungicides and insecticides, And you mentioned you asked about the volume. Normally, most of the products they recommend at least 50 liters per acre, which normally can be done in the initial stage or maybe in the first application. In our case here for the breeding farm, we have like 43 acres of that. We are spraying, we start actually with 80 liters per acre of volume. And according to the how the plants start to develop and you have the vegetative growth, we end up reaching to 125 liters of water per acre. Okay, that has been providing a good coverage for the full canopy when the plant actually reached the full canopy stage, and it has been working well for foliar disease control so far.
Thanks, Newton. That's awesome information to share. Thank you.
No problem.
Eric, you have your hand up?
Hi, thanks, Rick, and thanks for answering the questions and challenging questions I was posting at the side there during the presentation. Just to share with you that we're increasingly using Lechler IDTA nozzles in the UK. And I know Elizabeth at Indian River Farms is changed over to sets of those this year. So there should be some good experiences gained from those. They get good penetration of the potato canopy and are classified as 90% drift reduction, which does allow us to still get good coverage in, let's say, challenging application conditions.
That's awesome, Eric. Thank you very much.
Any other questions before we sign off? All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much, Rick, for doing this. Again, as you mentioned, thank you also, Dwayne, for kind of putting the bug in the ear and being sort of the catalyst for making this happen. Really do appreciate those efforts. Any last comments, Rick?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Ryan, for setting it up, and thank everyone for joining, and wish everyone a good growing season.
And if there's someone on your team or someone that you know that would benefit from this webinar, I have recorded it, and I will be making it available on. We'll probably put it on YouTube, and we'll link it on the agronomy site. So just so that you have that. Okay.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Thanks
Bye for
again,
now.
Rick. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Have a great day.